Welcome back, folks. Last time we were going over some of the interactions of the mind with relationship to the experiences that we undergo. And just to set the context and have a reference about why we are going through all this, it is because we are laying the groundwork for a couple of verses that we are going to see next, and one of which happens to be one of the most popular, of which is kind of synonymous with what karma yoga is, and we will understand where that is coming from. So we saw last time that the way the mind is constructed or constituted, there are these vrittis on top of consciousness, and these vrittis, which are in English roughly impressions, that are created on consciousness, which are replicas of real. Well, real is kind of a funny word here, because really what real means can be confusing in this context that we are discussing things. So the senses, whatever they interact with, that the replica of that is what gets created in the mind. And we saw how a tangible object like a ball or a fruit that we see gets created as a vritti in the mind. And that is where our first-hand experience takes place. It takes a while. Now, time itself is a kind of ambiguous entity in all this process. And what time is a very deep and complicated discussion, which we are not going to get into here, but we are just going to ignore that piece of phenomenon at the moment when we are discussing this. So now let us look at the next slide that we have. So we kind of understood that if there is a tangible object that the senses interact with, then it performs the action of creating an impression, a vritti in the mind. Similarly, there are intangible interactions that take place, which too form vrittis, impressions on the mind. So we have love, hatred, anger, whatever, jealousy. All these, they form impressions, and one can only dare to imagine what kind of a complex pattern might be getting generated as these vrittis interact with each other. So one of the things is that these vrittis that are there, they are not uniform. It is not a homogeneous environment. As in general, as a common layman experienced person, this is not a homogeneous environment. The vrittis have different degrees of intensity, different amplitudes. So one vritti can overpower other vrittis. It dominates the field of the mind for some time. It has got its own lifetime, and then it not goes away, but it remains subdued. Some of them go away, some of them stay for a while until the right opportunity presents and they can come back up again. So these intangible things that one interacts with also result in vrittis, which when you compare with the vritti of a tangible object is not different. It is indifferent from that. So it is, if we compare ice with water, then the the ice might have a form or something of different from water if you put water in a bottle or a vase or something like that. But it it eventually it results in the same material. So that is what happens here as well, that there is tangible and intangible, but in the mind they end up being something that shares the same construct and the same behavior too. So this intangible interaction that the mind has takes on different forms, and by studying these impressions, Vedanta, Hinduism, and even other religions, you may or may not know this kind of analysis of the mind, but you might come up with solutions, because now that you have understood the problem domain, you come up with solutions, and sometimes the problem domain is just called by different name by somebody else. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So here I have generalized. So we have got tangible experiences, tangible interactions with tangible objects, interactions with intangible objects. And there could be things that we are not able to classify as tangible or intangible. There's something in between. There could be something that supersedes it. In a sense, transcendental and all those words, they also apply to a certain state of the mind. So even those can be roughly translated into vrittis. So all these things constitute the makeup of the mind, and what one needs to be aware of is that this is all happening, I won't say at the same time, but it's all part of the same medium. So in terms of the vrittis, it's heterogeneous, but in terms of the medium, it is homogeneous. It is of the same material, if you will, where all these impressions come alive. Life is breathed into it and sustained, and it may or may not subside, but even if it does, it goes back. Just like you have a pot that is made out of clay and it lives for a certain time as a pot, and then with wear and tear it crashes, crumbles, shattered, becomes shards, and it returns back to the clay. Same thing is happening here, although obviously we know that clay can be further analyzed into molecules that make up clay, and so the same thing applies here as well, which we have done previously, and we might do a little bit of that later on. But I will just in the passing mention that this primary constituent that makes up the vrittis is nothing but consciousness. So this idea of name and form, there is a very technical way of treating this phenomenon or effect. And Vedanta, the Upanishads, they go over a lot of this. But one of the most masterly systematic and scientific inquiry and explanation of this is done by Shankara and his disciples. The disciples were also equally brilliant, and there are several textbooks written on that. And they go to varying degrees of detail. Some of them are stepping stones of how one reads one text based on the other. But the fact of the matter is that this is a very highly technical subject, technical topic. But it's not that if we don't know the technicalities of this. We don't understand or experience it. We experience it. That's the beauty of Vedanta. It explains all the complexities, but what it is really talking about is not complicated. It's simple. You, for instance, if you were to analyze milk, it is made up of these molecules, there is fat in it, and this is the how the atoms are structured and the molecules are structured, and this is the kind of energy this molecule has, and you can go on and on and on. And you at a point, at some point, you might even forget you're talking about milk, because it will start getting into chemistry and physics and whatnot. And here is a person who has no idea about all these complexities, physical and chemical complexities of milk, but he knows that this is where I get milk. He puts it in a glass and he drinks it. And what this person experience is a totally different experience than the person who is analyzing it. These are two different things. So we don't have to get overwhelmed with the technicalities, but it is good to know why some of these things in the Gita or the Upanishads are being said. Okay, so let's move on to the next. Now, this is a fairly complicated topic, and we are just scratching the surface, and we will be going to just stick to the bare minimum and try and not go overboard with this analysis, which is always a danger. You could get lost. There is this term that gets frequently used, analysis and paralysis. So you get lost in the analysis. Anyhow, so these vrittis that we talked about, this the ball, love, hatred, they are all vrittis that exist in the mind. There is one special vritti that is there, and that vritti, that is why I have deliberately shown it as thick compared to the other vrittis that are there. This special vritti, it imparts to us this notion of I-ness. So this is the ego. It's a special kind of vritti. So this is all some very master and classical work done by Shankaracharya, and he goes into it in a fantastic length of detail. When I say fantastic, I don't mean to say it is a fantasy, but just the brilliance of Shankara when he picks this topic and thread by thread analyzes it. So this is a special vritti, and it is very the way the analysis has been done in Vedanta Vedas and in Sanskrit. It's very interesting, the terminology that is get used. So in English, we call ego, which is the sense of I-ness. Different languages, in Urdu it is called ana, and in other Indian languages, ahankar is a very common phrase that gets used to represent ego. There are different kinds of egos, Swabhiman is there and Durabhiman, but let's not get into all those things. So this term that the Hindu scriptures come up with or use to define the ego is very interesting. It is called, as I mentioned, ahankara. So this is made up of two words, aham and kara. Why is it significant here? So if you were to look at a word, another word, similar word, not synonym but similar word in Sanskrit, like patrakar. Okay, so it is made up of two words, patra and kara. So kara is more like it's a suffix or a piece of a word that you attach to. So it is like a colorful, beautiful. So we are putting this full, we concatenate, attach full to this word, and then it imparts that kind of meaning, the adjective or whatever, to the noun. So patrakar means, patra is a letter or it could be a paper. So one who creates this paper is patrakar. The creator of the paper is patra. So this car is what a car is creator, and then you just keep attaching the different nouns, and then the word becomes that. So the creator of patra is patrakar. This is a word called chitrakara. Chitra is painting. So the creator of a painting is chitrakara. So he is a painter. Similarly, this vritti is ahankara. It is not the ego. It is the creator of the ego. And this has a very huge significance in the way ego is analyzed in this text. There is a wonderful analysis Shankara does in Viveka Chodamani, Durikdrisha Vivek, these kind of texts. You will see some very wonderful analysis. So this vritti is a special kind of vritti. It gives rise to this notion of I-ness, the creator of I, that is ahankara. So this vritti is ahankara. And why are we so curious or interested about this particular vritti? Because what happens is that this vritti, by giving rise to this notion of I-ness, all these other vrittis, they get associated with this I. So I feel hungry, I feel jealous, I have seen a ball, I have opened the gates of something, I've opened the door to my house. So this vritti that has created this ego becomes associated with the actions that get performed, and these actions, they actually take place in several dimensions. So when I am going to open the door of my car, it starts out way back in the mind that there is a vritti that has come up that says that you need to go to the market and buy something for some reason. And in order to fulfill that desire, that aim, the other vrittis have risen, and it eventually culminates into a sequence of actions. One of them being, I need to step out of the house and open the door of my car. So all these actions that take place, the reactions to these actions, the results of these actions, they get associated with this I-ness. Now, we do not have time to get into more details, but one thing that we need to be aware of, which is an important consideration in all this discussion that we are doing, is that the attachment is not as simple as the word makes out to be. So if the ego is working with a particular vritti, what happens is that it actually becomes, it takes over ownership, or it actually becomes that that vritti. That's what happens with the ego when it is influenced by one of these vrittis. And I'm really cutting short a lot of technical jargon when I'm explaining this fact. But a very simple analogy, if I can give, and which leads to a lot of confusion because this phenomenon takes place of being superimposed or um, being thinking that it is this object that is actually contemplating upon. So, for instance, if I have a car and I'm driving this car, and so long as I have this distinction of me being separate from the car, I'm kind of okay. So tomorrow, if there is a dent, if there is another car, my neighbors, or I don't know, somebody, a third person, there is that car and there is my car, and really the cars are same. There's no difference. It's just somebody else's car and my car. And when there is a stone or a ball comes and hits the car, this other car, and it forms a dent in the car, and I look at it, I watch it. Maybe I feel a little bit, but mostly not. It doesn't affect me. Uh, I might say, poor fellow, he will have to fix it. How did this happen? A fleeting thought for a minute or two, it will go away. Now, if this were to happen to my car, if the ball comes and hits my car, if the rock hits my car and creates a dent in this car, the reaction that I have is enormous. How did this happen? 1,000 thoughts will be flowing. There'll be anger because the that it is almost as if this dent is not on the car, but it's on me. I am the person who is being hurt, who is being damaged, if you want to use that word, damaged. So the problem here is this superimposition or this attachment, this what has happened is this car is being looked upon as me itself rather than as a object separate from me. And if something happens to this car, it is not really affecting me. It's a car. These things are going to happen. There is wear and tear, and you take it in the stride. You don't get affected by it. But in the reality, something like this happens. You get worked up, you get angry. We know that. So this is a very rough analogy to what is happening here. That there is this ego, and this ego, which is a vritti, is interacting with these other vrittis. And the fact of the matter is they are separate vrittis, but it comes to think of that as it itself. And there lies the problem, one of the problems of confusion that is there. It goes far deeper than this, but this is just one rough analogy about how Vedanta explains the problem of suffering. This is the root of the problem of suffering. So you want to go to a certain place from A to B, and then when you're going, you find that there is a stream, there's a river that's flowing, and you need to get across the river. So now that you know the problem, then you start thinking about, okay, how do I address this? How do I build a bridge? Do I find maybe I keep walking, the river narrows down at some place and I can cross. And now that the problem has been identified, one can think of solutions. Otherwise, you will just keep spinning your wheels, and you will end up nowhere, getting more and more frustrated. Okay. let's get to the, so this there is a particular word. So this the in English, the way it gets translated most often is the agent of action, and in Sanskrit, in the whole Vedic literature, it is called as karta. Karta and bhokta, there are two words. Karta is this agent of action. So this is the person who performs this action, and obviously he bears the consequences of the action he has performed. So if he were to perform something good, he has good results. Something bad, he gets bad results. And I have got one more slide that I might spend some more time on this fact. Okay, so now that we know that this mind is this collection of a constant churn of vrittis, these impressions, unending flow of different interactions of patterns, dominance of a variety of vrittis in the mind, to the point that the mind is very fickle and always in a state of turbulence based on the dominance of the vrittis that ride our mind. Habit is a very important consideration that gives rise. We saw last time about the example about how if I were to keep making a circle with a blunt object on a tree for several hours, it's going to cut a shape in the bark of a very strong tree, and that is kind of what happens with habits. So much so that one can also think of them as crossing the life terms, and this topic could be debatable and arguments which we don't want to get into, but it is roughly comparable to the idea of genetics. So we say that somebody has black eyes, blue eyes, hair. That's the physical aspect of it. But the if I don't know if Einstein had kids or not, but if he had, then and if it turns out to be brilliant, one might think that it is coming from the genes. Whatever the blueprint that one has, the genetic code that is there in the DNA, it seems to influence a lot of factors, and some of them could be mental as well. So that's kind of roughly analogous to what it is that gets carried over before birth from whatever place, and it kind of influences or determines the way, some of the ways in which you act and perform in the world. And obviously we know that it keeps contributing to your life in general. So whatever you learned as a kid, as a school student in school, it affects the rest of your life. You pick up some good habits, some bad habits on the way, and they continue to dominate your sphere of experience. So these various vrittis that collect in the mind of different sorts, an attempt was made to understand how do we address this situation. And this is a subjective topic. Uh, there are two or three entire chapters dedicated to this, and I particularly don't get too much into it. So it's going to be a long time before we reach there, and I in fact don't even I won't even go through this chapter when we get to that 16, 17 major portion of 18. But as a matter of academic completion, it does help, and it does make sense. So it's like when people started studying science, there were so many trees, so many animals. So how do you study them? You basically you find patterns, what kind of trees that are there, and then you bucket them, you put them in buckets. So that's the taxonomy is what the scientific term is. So then you have got evergreen plants, perennials are there, seasonal are there, and you name it, and there's this whole science of botany. The animals, you have got mammals and and you've got fish and birds, and you do your analysis, and it's somewhat arbitrary. You might say, we have got five types of five species, and if you really want, somebody might even come up with a sixth one and say, this maybe, or somebody might say, only there are only four, there are not five. It's, we have in general accepted it. We accept it because it helps in general to understand what's happening. So when we say something is a feline cat versus a dog, we have some idea. We don't debate about it. The difference is somewhat obvious, and it helps us in managing this massive body of knowledge and objects that are there in the world. And so the analysis is just a way of understanding this monumental sea of objects that is there. And if plants and animals are complicated, this vrittis are 1,000 times more complicated than that. And to be able to analyze them is a gargantuan task. Nevertheless, what has been done is it has been broken down into three buckets: sattva, rajas, and tamas. So how do you do that? And that's a whole big science. You want to call it, fine. Somebody wants to call it some other name, fine. Now, when we perform this analysis, the taxonomy of plants and animals, and there's a certain objective in mind, and people had that at the back of your mind. And once it was done in certain stream of science, it got replicated across different things. Similarly here, there is an objective. The objective is that one needs to, the whole premise of Vedanta is to enable man to eliminate suffering from his life. And although it might appear to be a very fantastic goal, it's upon study you will realize that it's not that fantastic, and it is doable because all this analysis will lead to that. So in this attempt, in this very systematic analysis of how one can get to this state where one eliminates suffering from life, in this attempt, there are many things, but one of the main things is that the elimination of ignorance, that this cooked up notion of ego is separate from consciousness, and that consciousness and ego are different things that are not connected with each other. That ignorance, to eliminate that ignorance, we well, rather elimination of that ignorance will help man to get to this state that Vedanta is 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 asking aspirants to go towards. And this is a very different goal it doesn't promise you a heaven after death, or a heaven in here, or a prosperity and land and money and power. Right? It doesn't promise you all those things. So it promises you something very, very fundamental, and it addresses all these other things, and it doesn't even well, the most wonderful thing is it doesn't even lay any conditions that you need to be like this, like that, or you have to achieve certain state, or it in fact says it is possible for anybody and everybody, is what Vedanta says. You don't have to die in order to reach this state. You don't have to have performed some rituals. You don't have to have pleased somebody else, whatever. There could be a whole lot of list of things that one can think of. But this union, and that is what is yoga. Yoga, the term yoga is union of what? Of these two things. And the interesting thing is Shankara's brilliant work on this is in the introduction of the Brahma Sutras. He has got his commentary on Anyonya Adhyasa. It's a very technical thing. In English, it will translate to mutual superimposition. It's a crude translation, but it's the best you can get to. And very, very wonderful. And maybe sometime we will get into some details of it. But now that you have figured out that you want to become a doctor so that you will eliminate disease and unhealthiness or whatever. So now that you have figured out, now you say, okay, what do I need to do in order to become a doctor? So I have to take these. So there are these 20 topics that are there, out of which I have to pick these 5 topics. In these 5 topics, this one is more important. And you do an analysis of that. So that is in this aim, in this goal to eliminate this ignorance, to be able to achieve this state. What are the vrittis that would help you? What would deter you? What would be something that are neutral and can be pushed so that they would be of help to you rather than be a deterrent to you on this process? So that was the criteria applied in order to classify these different vrittis. And once that is done, once you figure that out, then you know, okay, these 10 types of things are going to help me to eradicate, to eliminate this ignorance, to take me to this final goal. And so I would like to concentrate more on these vritti, and I would want to eliminate those that are going to cause a problem for me in order to reach this goal. So that is one level of rationale behind classifying these vrittis. And once you do that, then the second question is going to be, okay, so I want these vrittis, I'm interested in this, how do I do that? And I do not want these vrittis, and how do I do that? So that's another huge discussion. We are not going to get into that. And the reason I'm telling you this will be obvious when we start with the next couple of verses. So this analysis has led to the 3 buckets that I'm showing here. It is called as Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. That is 3 buckets in which we can put these vrittis into. Out of these 3 buckets, the Sattvic vritti is the one that one should try and get more of that. That is something that will help us get closer to our goal. The Rajasic Vritti is kind of neutral, but it's also not that desirable, but it is far better than the Tamasic Vritti. And so this, I've tried to use some kind of color coding, and in fact, in certain text or even certain um, the way uh, um, a religious person, a mendicant, sannyasi dresses, they or uses some of these things in day-to-day life. These colors, they influence that a lot. Actually, they have influence. So thus, sattva, it's you take anything, not just vrittis. You take the color of the shirt itself, anything you take, and it can be classified into these three things. So this is a sattvic thing. The foods that they have been analyzed into these three degrees of classification: sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. And it's very naive to say that now that I know this and someone has told me that sattvic is what will get me there, let me just concentrate on this and become sattvic. That is a very naive notion. The mind is a very complicated and complex thing, and it is a strange mixture of sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic elements, and it's never steady. It's in a constant state of flux, and which kind of vrittis will dominate at what time is an extremely difficult thing to know. There is lots of work that is being done, that has been done on this. There's virtually no stone left unturned in this analysis and the later work that needs to be done in order to achieve a certain status. There is Patanjali's this whole treatise of books on how one needs to do yoga sadhana, and you'll come across these terms there. So we are going to see in a later slide that although these three gunas, now you should get the idea that when I say these three gunas, these are called as gunas, by the way. So we are basically coloring the vrittis with this color. So I was just mentioning that sattva is generally a transparent or white color. Tamasic can be a very dull or dark color. That's colors also have been organized or analyzed into this. The idea being that when you look at a certain color, it should convey to you a certain positive meaning. And end goal is what is important. Do anything it takes for you to be able to know this consciousness that you are not separate. Do whatever makes it possible. And that is what is said in this Bhagwad Gita. Shri Krishna says, even if you have to resort to means that might not seem righteous, it does not matter. Your goal is this union. For that, you do whatever it takes. That is dharma. Whatever you do in order to do this, that is your dharma. It might at this moment appear that it is not right. Even then, that is right. This whole karma kshetra in this the battle of Kurukshetra. Dharma kshetra Kurukshetra. Samaveta. This is the first shloka in the Bhagavad Gita. So we are almost reached at the end of our time here, but these three gunas they form everything. We can take all the vrittis and we can divide them into these three, and they always they they they, they project themselves. There's a better word for it than that, but they kind of keep the mind, the ego occupied. Our attempt should be to make use of them and to see how we can minimize this turbulence, so that there comes a point, and I'm making a big leap and jump here. There comes a point when you use sattva to reach that state, but at that point you have to actually even give up sattva too, which means it is a state of no vrittis, because sattva is even if it's sattva, it is still a vritti. And we'll see what it is called. We are all time here. Um, the doctrine of karma, we are is a big topic, but we are only going to scratch the surface of this topic, and we might spend, I don't know, next time 15-20 minutes or so. And if you start analyzing this technically, look at some of these works that have been done, they will drive you nuts, trying to understand how this works and who influences what and how that is becomes alive in the mind and so on and so forth. It will drive you nuts. So we just want to know enough to be able to explain the couple of stanzas that we are going to encounter in the next couple of verses that are there. Okay, thanks for listening, and we will talk next time.